All right, YouTube, this is a video about what is being termed Operation American Spring. It's got its own website, and there are a bunch of other websites that are hosting it, linking to it, and talking about it, and so forth. The idea of the site, the plan that they're espousing seems to be that they're going to have mass, not actual like an open warfare revolution scenario, but mass protests, mass demonstrations, and mass calls to arms for all Americans. The idea being that they want to force Obama to resign or literally take him out of office by force and form some sort of council that they discuss on their site, which, for reasons I will then mention, is preposterous. Um, Essentially redesigning the government. The idea stated by the site is to restore the Constitution and restore order and so forth. Now, as a libertarian, I think that right now, under Obama's leadership and under former leadership as well, the Constitution is in danger. However, this site, let's look past for a moment the very real possibility that this is some sort of NSA honeypot designed to get people to submit emails or share this around or like their Facebook page and thus end up on some sort of government list. Let's look past that possibility and to the functional arguments of the site. If you look at the sort of people like Ted Cruz, for example, that they're suggesting be on some sort of congressional panel to look into crimes committed by Obama or something. Number one, I'm looking through the Constitution. I'm failing to find an actual a legal notation where such a council can actually be formed. Number two, anytime I see someone like Ted Cruz, who is an establishment pro-Zionist GOP member, mentioned, I automatically assume that this so-called restoration of the Constitution isn't a real restoration of the Constitution. It's just more right-wing banter. It's just more establishment Republican reactionary nonsense. It's literally no different, except it's on the flip side, on a partisan level, from Occupy Wall Street. It's literally no Occupy Wall Street. Well, we're tired of the bankers. We're tired of. We want the right to do this and the right to do that. We want women's rights. We want we want to be able to smoke our weed and so forth. Essentially preserving parts of the Constitution while at the same time being blatantly partisan in doing so. This isn't a real revolutionary idea. This is a reactionary idea. What they're suggesting essentially is a return to like some sort of weird 1980s style Reaganomics or something like that. And then the reasons that they're going after people like Obama are completely wrong. Yes, they get it right on the NSA and things like that, but all the other stuff is complete partisan nonsense. Again, they're mentioning Ted Cruz and saying, actually, let me go to their site. I'll even go to their site right now. Even though that'll probably get me on some sort of government list. But note to any NSA agents, I don't support this move because I'm not a Republican. Operation American Spring, OAS, it's basically a ripoff of OWS, Occupy Wall Street. Two patriots, black, white, red, yellow, brown, male, female, civilian, military, the list goes on. Mission: restoration of constitutional government, rule of law, freedom, liberty of the people, for the people, by the people, from despotic and tyrannical federal leadership. See, if you just read that, any true libertarian would say, oh, this sounds like a good idea. But then you go past that and you find the concept of operation. Assumptions: millions of Americans will participate. Possible. They could certainly find millions of people who are very disgruntled with the way things are going right now. American veterans and patriots are energized to end the tyranny, lawlessness, and shredding of the U.S. Constitution. I would agree with that. Government is not the target. It is sound, corrupt, and criminal leadership that must be removed. So essentially, they're putting themselves at a level different from like anarchists, and they're saying, we don't want to get rid of the government. We want to get rid of the corrupt people in the government. That makes sense. Nobody in their right mind can debate with this. Those in power will not hesitate to use force against unarmed, peaceful patriots exercising their constitutional rights. That sort of depends on the city that you happen to be in. If you're in an urban area, yeah, the police are going to beat you down. In a more rural area, they don't give a shit. Patriots may be killed, wounded, incarcerated. There is no hope given today's technology of secrecy for the effort, nor do we want it secret. Whatever. Concept of operations. Phase 1. See, they put it in phases here to make it seem, legit. And by the way, at least one of the founders of this movement is a retired NSA officer, which makes it so much more obvious that this is some sort of honeypot. And another one is a complete Zionist who is on record as being a self-avowed Zionist. I'm sure that the Zionists in the Republican Party wouldn't misuse libertarian fervor for their own political gain as a show of force. They wouldn't do such a thing, nor would the left ever, even though they've done it before, nor would the left do such a thing. Phase 1, field millions, as many as 10 million patriots who will assemble in peaceful, nonviolent, physically unarmed. That's good that they're mentioning that. Display of unswerving loyalty to the U.S. Constitution and against the incumbent government leadership in D.C., which means Obama, go full bore, no looking back, steadfast in the mission. Phase 2, 1 million or more of the assembled 10 million must be prepared to stay in D.C. as long as it takes to see Obama, Biden, Reid, McConnell, Boehner, Pelosi, and Attorney General Holder removed from office. See, Boehner, this, by the way, this is more right-leaning GOP. Boehner is seen as weak, which is why they would want to remove him. As for, I can agree with trying to remove Holder should have already been removed from office. If Obama had any balls, he already would have fired him anyway, so it's ridiculous that he's even in there. So that part, I can agree with him there. The senior Republican in the U.S. House of Representatives will become Speaker of the House, and the U.S. House of Representatives will elect a temporary president and vice president of the United States. I'm not sure that that's actually constitutional to do. I'm not sure there's actually any framework in place to account for essentially the president is simply the highest ranking surviving member in the chain of command, or the last surviving member, or the only one that hasn't been removed or incapacitated. Like when Nixon was impeached, his vice president became the president. It wasn't a very good president. He only lasted one partial term, but he was entitled to that office. He then pardoned Nixon, which just showed he was just as corrupt. But I'm not sure that the House of Representatives, and of course they would say the House because it's controlled by Republicans, I don't believe that they have the right actually to do that. There may be some obscure rule in some Supreme Court proceedings or something for that, but I don't believe so. I don't believe that that's actually true. Phase 3, those with the principles of West, Cruz, Dr. Ben Carson, Lee, DeMint, Paul, Governor Walker, Sessions, Gowdy, Jordan will comprise a tribunal and assume positions of authority. Again, I'm not sure this is actually constitutional to do so. Recommend appropriate charges against politicians and government employees to the new U.S. Attorney General appointed by the new president. So essentially what this would be, if these, let's assume for a moment that they actually went through with this and it worked and they did manage to get Obama and Biden and so forth removed. Essentially you would see a largely Republican tribunal prosecuting Obama, which I don't give a crap about that because Obama and Pelosi and all should be removed from office and prosecuted. They have violated the Constitution and they have violated their oaths of office. But what you would be left with is essentially a completely Republican power setup, which is their goal in apparently doing this. I'm almost not even sure if this is to be taken seriously. One part of me wants to believe that this is either a mockery of Occupy Wall Street, or a way to draw in more libertarians for voting for whoever runs next time as a Republican. Or that this is some sort of really bizarre trolling. That's sort of what it almost looks like, and the site's not very well built. I mean, it's a very primitive site and so forth, but here's the thing. Any real revolutionary fervor that's going to hold the government accountable is going to need to be nonpartisan. It's going to need to go beyond the two-party system because both parties have essentially done the same thing. As some of these people, DeMint is a decent person, Cruz is not. Paul is a decent person, Walker is not. Some of these individuals, yes, they are at least marginally libertarian individuals. Others are just complete establishment Republican figures. They're leaders of the Tea Party, which was co-opted by the Palins and the other evangelical morons after Paul sort of left that behind and allowed other people to run it for him. Look through all the law of nature rules. A fluffy, cuddly lamb gets eaten by a mean old wolf is not an illegal or immoral event. The law of it even sounds reactionary. This sounds like a reactionary manifesto. The problem being, even a true reactionary party could probably put into place some sort of fixes for the corruption in our system. But the Republican Party isn't strictly a nationalistic or reactionary party. The Republican Party and the Democratic Party are two puppets, each held by a different hand of the same puppet holder. Both of the parties are backed and funded largely by the same corporations, the same banks, the same large unions, the same foreign special and domestic special interest groups. Trying to hold the government to a higher standard and get rid of corruption by putting a bunch of Republicans in power is no different than the ethos upon which Obama himself was elected. People got tired of Bush, they get tired of his corruption and lies, and they said, well, we'll elect a bunch of Democrats, that'll make everything better. And it didn't work. And people had elected Bush because they remembered, they hearkened back, even though Clinton was not very unpopular. They said, well, there's been a lot of scandals, especially the blowjob. That was terrible, totally immoral. The blowjob just really did it for him. Oh, well, we get tired of him, so we'll elect, Bush. And before that, well, Ronald Reagan, we all look back at him and people try to convince us that he was some great person. In reality, he was a corporate pawn who had Alzheimer's, at least in his second term, and probably part of his first, and was completely and utterly controlled by other people for the second term. People said, well, we got tired of Reaganomics, so we elected Clinton. You go back, people keep switching back and forth between these two parties. They elected Obama because they remembered how bad Bush was. They elected Bush because they didn't like Clinton. They elected Clinton because they didn't like Bush Sr., who was, an abject failure in every way, and then Reagan before him, who was average at best. People keep bouncing back and forth from one corporate-sponsored party to the other. And now they're expecting that this, of all things, is actually going to create some sort of beneficial change for the country. And again, that's beyond even considering the possibility that this is some sort of honeypot to collect people's personal information. People go on this site, they sign up, say, yeah, I want email updates. Yeah, I'll like your Facebook page. I'll watch your videos on YouTube. And the government just sits back laughing because for $10 to host the site and 2 hours of work constructing it and a little bit of work pushing it on online forums and places like Facebook and other so-called patriotic sites, all of a sudden, well, everything's peachy now. Hundreds of thousands of people have signed up for our Patriot March or whatever it is. This is the sort of thing that's doomed to failure. Because even if they could get 100 million Americans to go to Washington, D.C. and storm the White House and burn the Smithsonian and do all of these other things, even if they could get this to happen, their solution to Obama is simply to put the same sort of people in power that were already in power before Obama was in office. And many of these problems that we're having right now, things like the NSA, predate Obama. He's made them worse, yes. He's perpetuated them, yes. But they date to the Bush era, who was a Republican, an establishment Republican, almost exactly the same as somebody like Ted Cruz or Paul Walker. Very, very similar. What is this possibly going to accomplish? If people want to have a referendum on the government to force the incumbents out of office, hold them accountable, potentially prosecute them for violating their oath of office, if people want to get rid of the corruption, they need to keep doing it like California and Kentucky, I think Kentucky or Tennessee right now, are both holding votes on bills designed to take water and electricity away from NSA installments. If every state did that and simply said, we're simply not going to provide infrastructure to any federal building used for surveillance purposes, we wouldn't have any problem. Because the federal government's not exactly going to mobilize the military and attempt to occupy all 50 states at once. People need to use a little bit of common sense here and get past this jaded two-party mentality of, well, I support Obama because Bush was a terrible president. Well, now I support Ted Cruz because Obama's such a terrible president. You've been screwed both ways. Both parties have screwed you. What don't you understand about that? It took two parties several decades to design all of the problems that are going on right now. It has nothing to do with partisan politics. It completely transcends them when the same organizations, even organizations within the government, are backing both sides, controlling both sides. This is Goldman Sachs, big Romney donor, big Obama donor. Do you see nothing wrong with this? If you want accountability, you need to, yes, you do need to have mass action. You need to hold a referendum through people essentially voting by showing up and raising their banners and yelling a lot. It intimidates the government, at least to a certain extent. That needs to happen, but you also need to reform election laws. You also need to defend all parts of the Constitution, not just the ones that you happen to morally agree with. To the left, that means they're failing because they don't believe in the Second Amendment. To the right, that means they're failing because they don't essentially believe in the right to privacy, because they're constantly going after wedge issues like gays and abortion. You need to preserve the entire Constitution. Once you start eroding one piece of it, it just forces the other side to erode other pieces and to make wedge issues. That's the problem. You need campaign finance reform, and you need to defend the entire Constitution. You can't do that by voting for Obama because Bush was bad and because he happens to be black, so he's special. And you certainly can't do it by putting somebody like Ted Cruz in charge of a special and possibly only dubiously constitutional tribunal to try Obama for the same things that someone like Ted Cruz himself would do if he were in office and not held accountable. It makes no difference. The two-party system has fundamentally failed when we have allowed the same businesses, unions, lobbies, and internal groups to control both parties, and to convince these people that they're little more than figureheads, and that insiders and businessmen and lawyers should essentially write all legislation, because let's face it, like Obamacare was written by the healthcare providers, all of the laws are essentially written by the same people. And most of them don't even hold office. That's the problem. So this Operation American Spring shit, it's not going to work. Because even if it fundamentally wins, it fundamentally triumphs and 50 million people show up in DC for a weekend, it won't change anything. Temporarily it might. For a few years or months or whatever, things will seem to be better, and they'll make a little progress here and there, and then things will break down into the same old partisan divide that they were to begin with. It's a complete failure if it's not a complete honeypot. So, you know, no, I would support, if it were a libertarian referendum, I'd probably support it if it was lawful in nature, because libertarians aren't the same as anarchists, but these people seem to be a bunch of Republican reactionaries whining and bitching, no different than the Tea Party, no different than Occupy Wall Street, no different than the hippies, no different than any of these groups, all of which were short-sighted, didn't know what they were doing, and were a flash in the pan, and ultimately changed nothing, and are remembered for having done very, very little. Peace out.